Welcome, Guite. Welcome to Apollos Watered.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to join you tonight.
And it is tonight where you're at, and it's St. Patty's Day.
It is indeed. It's, yes, St. Patrick, great. Not only the patron saint of Ireland, but of course the great evangelist of Ireland. Of course, it goes without saying that he was in fact an Englishman, you know, and was a young lad in Cumbria, a Cumbrian shepherd. He was kidnapped by pirates and taken to Ireland and sold as a slave. And then he managed to escape his slavery, went back to England, and lo and behold, Christ said to him, "Can you hear the voice of Ireland calling you? You have to go back to the very people who captured you and evangelize them." Imagine going back so he came to Ireland with the gift in his very presence of forgiveness and redemption and renewal. I mean, it was a great gift to give to Ireland again today.
And it's hard to believe that it is St. Patrick's Day, and so many people don't even know about it.
No, I've just put on my blog a poem I wrote about St. Patrick, which was celebrating, celebrating all things Patrick and Ireland, of course, and I think the last line of the poem is, last couple is a gospel seed that flowered in belief, a greening glory coming into leaf, but also to celebrate, the gospel that drew him there and continues to draw, the apostles of Christ everywhere to witness the resurrection and give us a bit of good news for a change.
Yeah, that is good news for a change. We could all use some good news. Speaking of good news, one of the ways that we start off the show with our Fast Five. Are you ready?
I am.
Okay, now you're a musician.
Mm-hmm.
Many people know that. I mean, anyone that follows you know that. But in your opinion, the greatest musician of all time is?
Well, composer Mozart, instrumentalist Clapton.
Oh, you were prepared for that question. Have you had it before?
No, never. Good response.
Okay, well, how about this one? If you could travel with any rock group from all time, who would it be and why?
Oh, the Grateful Dead, without question, because their whole group was about community. There was scarcely a distinction between the band and the fans. And I think that experience, the Deadheads experience, I mean, a very ironic name, of course, because you could scarcely find people more alive. But of course, Grateful Dead were called not, in some kind of awful death metal way or anything like that. The phrase "the Grateful Dead" is a phrase that cultural anthropologists use and also historians of folktale, because it's a strong motif in folktales in every culture, where the questing hero on his journey does a complete favor by burying a dead person who's not been given proper honors. He helps the widow bury her husband or whatever. He does it where there's no possibility of return. And then later on the story, he's magically helped to get across a river or to do, and it turns out that he's been blessed by the Grateful Dead, those whom you've helped, who are grateful. So that's, they were interested in, folklore and anthropology, and that's where the band's name originally came from. So it's founded in mutuality and gratitude. And I think that would be the best on the road experience, I think.
Huh. I had no idea.
Need the substances, of course, because I have faith, but faith is also mind expanding, which is the strict meaning of psychedelic.
Okay, number three. How about this one? Who is the one historical figure, not a biblical figure, but just historical figure that you would love to have a conversation with?
Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Why?
He was one of the greatest conversations. I mean, his prose and poetry are marvelous, but everybody says that his conversation was just extraordinary. He had this extraordinary flow. His face was animated when he spoke. He had read everything. He'd thought deeply about everything. He could converse on any topic. There's a famous story that when he was trying to get back from Malta at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, and was in fact on Napoleon's personal hit list because of his journalism, he ended up going through Rome with an American naval captain. And afterwards, the American naval captain was said, "What was it like being with Samuel Taylor Coleridge?" And he said, "I ain't heard nothing like it since Niagara Falls." So there's Apollos watered for you, if you like. Because he had this extraordinary journey back to a fully mature Trinitarian Christian faith in the second half of his life. And I wrote a long book on Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, just called Mariner, a voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So he's a great hero of mine.
How many books have you written? That's not one of my questions, but how many
I
books
was
have
trying
you
to count
written?
that. I think it's about 16,
Wow. There's a lot.
counting collaborations with artists and things like that. But yeah, I think there are 16
Okay.
books with my name on the spine, as it were.
It's a lot. But okay,
Yeah.
well, here's your next question. You've been to the States several times, but what's the one food you have come to love in the States?
Now there's a good question. I think tacos, actually, because we don't have Mexican food here in quite the same way. We have Indian food. We have fantastic Indian curries, but I quite like Mexican. I have to say, I normally drink either beer or whiskey, but I have to say, I finally found out on a trip to San Diego what a margarita actually is. And there's, I used to listen to that Jimmy Buffett song, Wasting Away Again in Margaritaville. And in my naivety as an Englishman listening to this in, our rainy streets, I thought Margaritaville was just some particularly laid back and loose place somewhere in Florida. I had no idea that it was more a state of mind than a state of the United States. And so I was it was a great revelation when I finally had my first margarita.
And where was that at?
It was in San Diego.
San Diego. Okay.
Not the home of the margarita, but, I nevertheless had what I now know to have been a very good one.
Oh, that was not an answer that I was expecting, but that's okay. Okay, how about this one? If you could be one piece of literature, not your own, what piece of literature would you be and why?
I would be Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, because I think it's almost the most perfect poem in English, just for the sheer sound of it. Because it moves from a place of desolation towards a place of vision, or at least the possibility of vision. And because it has, strangely, just towards the back of the poem, this extraordinary image for which there's no logical precedent, it just appears, where Keats talks about magic casements, windows, magic casements opening on perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. And that image, which I first came across when I was a very sort of rather depressed and homesick teenager, when I read it, opened up poetry to me and opened up somewhere within poetry a spiritual possibility. So yeah, if I had to be something, I'd be Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. It's a piece of pure perfection.
I've never read it, but I want to.
Oh, it's just astonishing.
Every time I've watched any of your videos online, there's all these things that I'm like, well, when am I going to get to that? I want to read that. I want to read that. There's so much.
And he was such a young man when he wrote it as well. I mean, he died at the age of 25 or 26, of tuberculosis. And he had this sudden flowering a couple of years before his death. He'd been an okay poet. And then suddenly, over 2 years, he became a transcendently great poet. And then he died, And but Nightingale is I think the most perfect of his 5 great odes.
Well, hearing about your reading, watching your videos online, hearing about your poetry, reading your books, I want to hear a little bit of your biography. And I found this, by the way, in your wiki entry.
I didn't write that. I have no idea who wrote that.
I don't know, but it's the most entertaining, insightful wiki I've ever heard in my life. This is what they wrote. What would happen if John Donne or George Herbert journeyed to Middle Earth by way of San Francisco, took musical cues from Jerry Garcia and fashion tips from Bilbo Baggins, and rode on the back of a Harley?
Yeah, that pretty much covers the bases, I have to say.
That's the funniest thing I've ever seen for a description of somebody.
Yeah, it's funny. Sometimes people use that as an introduction to my lectures, and I think, like, well, where do I go from here?
Well, tell us a little bit about your biography for those that aren't familiar with you. You're very well known. You've written a lot of books. You're known throughout.
Yeah, well, it's kind of everybody's story is a strange and interesting story if one really takes it seriously, and we'll hear them all in full in heaven and delight in them. But but I was born I was, people think of me as a very sort of, almost a quintessential English professor, which I suppose in some respects I am, but I'm not. It's not the usual biography for such one. I was actually born in Nigeria. And in fact, my first name is Ayodeji, which is a Yoruba name, which means the second joy or joy again. And my father was a lecturer in classics, Greek and Latin out there, but also a Methodist local preacher. So I spent the first 10 years of my life in Africa, first in Nigeria and then in Zimbabwe, at Rhodesia as it was then. And that influenced me a lot, I think, in terms of just having a slightly different perspective on things. I loved my time there. I had a happy childhood. Then we went to Canada, and around my teens, and just as I would have been getting ready to go into high school in Canada, my parents felt that I was losing my British identity, which is quite funny because I scarcely had one. I mean, we used to go back each year to England, in the vacation, so I kind of knew my English and Scottish relatives. But so they shipped me off, which is a kind of habit of the English middle classes. They shipped me off to a boarding school in London. The school itself, it was part of a day school. The day school itself was a great school, and I had a fantastic education there. But the boarding school was just a small house of 60 boys who weren't very happy to be there, and a few masters who weren't happy to be there either. So it wasn't a very happy place. I didn't, but somehow in the course of that, by the time I'd got into what's called the sixth form there, where you can really specialize, we specialize earlier than in the States. And, you only do the last 2 years of high school, you're only effectively doing 3 subjects, one of which will be your university degree. So I did English and history and French. And I was very fortunate to win a scholarship to Cambridge, to Pembroke College, when I went up in 77. In the course of the trauma of going to the boarding school, and also the usual traumas of adolescence and stormy youth and questioning of all things, I lost my faith, or I think I probably fairly well discarded it. And it had been quite a strong and natural faith. Both my parents believe in Christians, which is a great blessing. But I became, in opposition to that faith, I became a very rigid from my sort of early teens onwards, I became a very rigid atheist. We didn't have Dawkins so much then, but the big sort of materialist, behaviorist type person was an American called B.F. Skinner. And I'm afraid, a fairly precocious boy, and I was reading the Scientific American, and I was also reading French philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and and Albert Camus under the bedclothes, as it were. So I was a kind of atheist existentialist, and my favorite text was Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and all that suited my moody adolescence. But in the middle of all that, because they couldn't afford to fly me home, and some holidays I would just be farmed out to relatives. One of these relatives dragged me along, and literally dragged me. I didn't want to go. I didn't know what it was about. Dragged me along to Keats's house on Hampstead Heath, the house where indeed he heard the Nightingale and wrote the poem. And I read this poem in the place where it was written. And I was, as I say, a very moody teenager, and the poem was up on a wall in the room. In fact, the manuscript in which he'd written it. And I don't know the poem, but it has this very sort of dark, low, kind of numbing start, which is where Keats is at until the Nightingale sings. It begins, "My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past, and Lethe-wards had sunk." Lethe, of course, the river of forgetfulness in Hades. And I was just like ticking every box there, like dull, ache, sunk, drunk, Lethe, pain. I was going like, oh yeah, I'm with you, man. Like, I totally get this. And then, of course, the poem suddenly changes. And he says, suddenly after that, Lethe-wards had sunk, The next line goes, "'Tis not through envy of thy happiness, of thy happy lot. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thy happiness, that thou light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. I thought, what was that? I mean, just amazing. It's beautiful. And of course, you know, it's a very sensual poem. He goes out into the garden to follow the sound of the nightingale, and it's dusk, and you get this incredible, because you can't fully see, all the other senses are heightened. You know, I cannot tell what flowers are at my feet, or what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet. So it's wonderful. And then as he goes on, his mind goes to thinking about the immortality of the nightingale. And the nightingale by this time has become, although he almost knows it, not a full emblem of his soul, you know. Because Keats is writing this poem, he's already got a death sentence. He knows he's got tuberculosis, you know. And so then he says, thou art not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by empress and clown. And then suddenly out of nowhere comes a biblical image. I mean, Keats was not a believer. Both his parents had died young. His brother was dying. He saw no good in the kind of stuffy churches around him. He knew the Bible, he knew the vocabulary. So suddenly in the middle of this poem, he imagines Ruth standing in the field of corn, hearing the nightingale that he's heard, the self-same voice that found its way into the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home, she stood in tears amidst the alien corn. And I was just feeling so homesick, like it really spoke to me. And then, of course, he says, perhaps this bird, this voice will open these magic casements on perilous seas and fairy lands forlorn. And then he comes back to himself and says, forlorn, the very word is like a bell that tolls me back. But he can still hear the nightingale. And he goes further. It seems to be calling him beyond himself. And of course, the famous last line of that poem, fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? There's the possibility of a complete spiritual awakening being offered in this poem. And I stood, you know, having been and read the poem and was astonished. And then I read it again and I felt that very possibility, that renewal opening up. And one of the things I thought about, you know, on the bus on the way home was that this really blew apart my worldview. Up to that point, I was willing to say that everything that happens in the brain is no different a chemical reaction than one that happens in a test tube. It's just a series of meaningless events that have accidentally given rise to this epiphenomenon of brief consciousness that means absolutely nothing in an indifferent universe that cares nothing for us. It's just a result of blind chance. You know, we're all sort of billiard balls on a table of action and reaction. That's what I thought. And then until that moment. And then I read this poem, I took it home, read it again. I thought, whatever else is happening when I read this poem, it's a bit more than the unwinding of a selfish gene. This isn't just enzymes and neurons firing. Something else completely transcendent is going on here. Now, I didn't immediately become a Christian or call it religion or bring God in, but what it did, it was like a kind of little green plant coming up and breaking open. I mean, a lot of people are no longer stuck in the kind of, but if you think about the rigid materialism of the 20th century and, you know, everything being explained away by Freud or Marx or Darwin or Newton, you know, the rainbow, everything was reduced to this mere pointless series of physical level activities, and there was not supposed to be any level other than the physical level, or if you thought there was, it was delusory, or it was private and subjective, but wasn't to do with the objective truth. And here is a thing that really objectively happened. So what happened then at that point for me is that, if you like, poetry became my new religion, or, you know, perhaps I could say harshly, my substitute religion. But C.S. Lewis used to like to quote the saying that romanticism is spilled religion. It's something that was once held beautifully and in balance in the kind of chalice of the faith. And when people lost the faith, little bits of that deep yearning, little bits of that sense that there's a beauty which is so transcendent that it must speak of a world beyond this one. All those things were sort of gathered up by the Romantic poets, spilt, did they but know it, from the communion table of the Christian faith. But at least they gathered a bit. And if romanticism is spilt religion, at least a bit of spilt religion is better than no religion at all.
Mm.
So I was spiritually opened up in some sense. And of course, I became a great seeker and went into all kinds of things and read about Zen and Taoism and stuff like that. But I came up to Cambridge really with poetry and the poetic imagination itself as the most positive thing in my life. And then in Cambridge, of course, I decided to study medieval and Renaissance literature, which was what Lewis was chair of. I mean, Lewis was before my time, but his presence, in a sense, was still there. And my very sensible director of studies said, well, you can't seriously read medieval poetry unless, first of all, you obviously read the Bible. And secondly, you won't understand Renaissance literature or English Renaissance literature if you don't read the Book of Common Prayer. But also you need to read certain classics. You need to read St. Augustine's Confessions at the very least, if not the City of God. And you should probably read some Bernard of Clairvaux and some St. Francis as well. So I started reading these great Christian texts, allegedly as a background to the understanding of English literature. But of course, I found them deeply compelling, and Augustine in particular, because one of the bad things about my atheism, now shading into agnosticism at the time, was that it depended, like so much modern thought, on what Lewis rightly called chronological snobbery, on the idea that, because we've been able to invent digital watches, we must be cleverer than Plato, and this is not the case. We become very good at certain minute and peripheral things, whilst completely ignoring the deepest matters of life and soul and death and, judgment and redemption and all those huge things to which we ought to pay attention, but instead, we have iPhones. But once I started reading St. Augustine, it was a little paperback translation of Penguin Classics. So you open this little book, and opening that little book was like opening, if you go into one of the great cathedrals, there's a great door, of course, but there's usually a little door in the door that you actually open and go through to get into the cathedral. And opening the covers of this little paperback book was like walking innocently through a little door that you could hold in your hand. And then finding yourself in this vast, spacious, beautiful realm of the mind of St. Augustine. And when you do that, you realize you can never again say Christians must be stupid to believe, or, believing in Christianity is intellectual suicide, or any of the things I thought it was. Because here was a mind that was manifestly greater than my own, and had previously not been a Christian, and had been a perfectly good, rhetorician, which is essentially what I was studying, the way language works, and who had come almost dragging himself, but had come to discover that Christianity was true. And of course, he'd come to discover it partly through his experiences of beauty. The most famous passage, apart from our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you, in Augustine, is probably the one where he says, late have I loved you. Beauty, always ancient, always new. I sought for you without you, with all those lovely things. And so I began, as it were, to feel that there might be more to Christianity than I thought there had been. And I found it in a very attractive form there. But also, I was just having essentially transcendent experiences reading poetry, which was often by Christians. So I could probably say, again, along with Lewis, there's quite a strong parallel, in fact, in the way my mind developed and my faith came about. Lewis effectively says in Surprised by Joy that his imagination was baptized before he was, and that the rest of him just took a little longer to catch up. And that's kind of what happened to me. And in the end, I was humming and erring and saying, well, I might be just making all this up, or it's a compensatory fantasy, all those kinds of things. But then one day, towards the end of my second year at university, I was reading the book of Psalms, again, not as a devotional exercise, because at that point I didn't believe, but in order to understand European poetry. I mean, because the book of Psalms, together with the Song of the Songs, are one of the great sources for the whole poetic endeavor. And I was reading Psalm 145, where it says, the Lord is near to all who call upon him. And again, that he is near to all such as fall. And suddenly I mean, very much to my surprise, because as far as I was concerned, I was reading aloud because that's how you read poetry. There's no point in reading poetry silently. It's meant to be tasted on the tongue. And I was reading this psalm, and suddenly and unequivocally, just undeniably, I was not alone in the room. There was an extraordinary presence there. There was a holy presence. It's very difficult to describe. It's as though at one moment, you know, I was the center of things, which we all are when we look out, you know, we see the world revolving around us like that. And the next moment I was right out on the furthest possible edge of existence, kind of hanging by a thread, while the whole of existence itself was taken up by this immense, unutterable, unalterable holiness, before which I felt I could do or say nothing, and on which I now realized I completely depended, literally like a creature hanging from a thread. I mean, sometime later, I found the passage in Isaiah that says, you know, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord lifted up and mighty, and his train filled the temple. And when Isaiah has that experience, he doesn't say, wow, I've had a religious experience. I must be a very holy guy. I think I'll go and start a cult in California. You know, he doesn't say that. You remember what he says? He says, woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I come from a tribe of unclean lips, and I've seen the Lord. And like, I should so not be here, is basically, and that was my experience. Now, of course, as you know, in the story in Isaiah, God knows that he feels, and the angel takes the coal of fire from the blazing fire of God's very presence and love and touches his tongue with it, you know, and he's cleansed because he felt his tongue was the thing that was not clean. And maybe that's a foreshadowing of communion. You can think about it in different ways. But anyway, I had this experience, and I kind of hoped, I mean, to be honest, I hoped it would go away. I was hoping that this was some sort of episode, you know, and that it would be, you know, it's like the flashbacks would clear, you know, but actually they didn't. In fact, they got more intense. So in the end, I did that thing you have to be really desperate to do, which is I went and saw my college chaplain and said, look, I'm having these experiences. Do you think there's anything you could do about it, you know? And he was very good. He was brilliant. I mean, he said, well, first of all, your mind in self-defense will try to relativize this, like you've tried to relativize and explain away everything else, like science tries to explain away everything. But this is a real experience, and you better pay attention to it. And he said, I think it's very clear what's happened. He said, you've taken the name of the Lord in vain. You were speaking the Psalms, did you but know it, to and in the presence of one who you thought wasn't there, but he was there, and he's made his presence clear. And he said, I think the best thing you can do is return not only to that psalm, but to all the other psalms, and this time turn to face the Holy One and say the psalms to him. You know, he's given you words to speak. And so he said, look, nobody ever comes to this chapel, but I say morning prayer and evening prayer in every morning and evening regardless. And morning prayer and evening prayer are essentially the psalms with a bit of topping and tailing. So you come every morning and we'll say these psalms together antiphonally to God. And I found that was the best part of my day. The pressure, as it were, of this presence was relieved, you know, by doing this. But he made a very interesting condition. He said to me, Malcolm, at the end of every psalm, as a Christian priest, a Christian believer, I'm going to say, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. And I don't think you should say that. You may know something, perhaps, of the Father, but you know nothing of the Son and the Holy Spirit. And you've already got into enough trouble with taking the Father's name in vain. You know, so I wouldn't recommend that. And then I was about to answer him and said, look, Malcolm, I know perfectly well that you could probably recite the Nicene Creed, and you can describe Augustine's Trinitarian theology to me, but that's not the kind of knowledge I'm talking about. So just hold back from that until the right time. So I did this for, you know, some weeks. And then a friend of mine with whom I was also studying literature told me that there was a really interesting event happening in Cambridge. It was actually at the Catholic chaplaincy, that a Franciscan friar, contemporary Franciscan friar, but, you know, in the brown habit and everything, was going to be giving a series of talks to which all students were welcome. And he said, look, this is exactly what happened in the Middle Ages. This is exactly how the university started, preaching friars, the Franciscans and the Black Friars. We could go along to that and see it happening in our own day, and it'll really help us to understand how Chaucer and people got, their ideas. So again, it was allegedly a bit of background. I mean, I think this guy knew more than he was saying. He was a very devout Christian, devout Roman Catholic, and anyway, there was a Franciscan friar who was speaking, was utterly brilliant. There was a guy called Eric Doyle, who's in heaven now, but so I went along, and he started talking about dependence and vulnerability. And I remember I said this image, I felt like I was hanging by a thread. I knew now that my entire existence was contingent on the will and the love and the look of another who was God. And that I wasn't I was no longer the center of anything. I was hanging by this thread. So this guy started talking about how a babe in the womb is utterly dependent on the umbilical cord. And that even when the babe is born and the cord is cut, it hasn't even got the muscles to turn itself over. All it can do really is cry and hope that some parent will hold it tenderly. And I thought, God, I know what this is like. And then he turned, he could have been looking at me, he said, you think that I'm going to say that that's how we are as creatures, mere creatures, mortals in the face of a transcendent creator. That's what you think I'm going to say. And in one sense, you'd be right, because he is the creator and we are the creature and we do depend. But what I really want to say to you is that transcendent God loves us so much that he himself has become one of us, that he has become as dependent as that tiny babe. And he said, because he's love, and he knows you cannot love from a position of power. You cannot love from above. You cannot love anybody. It's a terrible relationship where one person holds all the cords. So God loves us enough not only to become human, but to be born, to be this, to depend on the umbilical cord in Mary's womb, to be the little child in the straw. And that's how you feel about God. But God in his utter love becomes as vulnerable as you are in Christ and comes and pleads to you to turn to him and suffers with you and for you. And he becomes so defenseless. I mean, he went on, that he becomes this wafer in your palm, when you could take that, you could tear it in pieces, you could spit on it, you could grind it under your heel. He has no defenses. That's why he's nailed to a cross. He cannot possibly strike you. And he who is almighty comes in all weakness to win your love. And somehow in the midst of his saying all of that, the penny dropped. And it's not that I ceased to think of God as all holy, but I also suddenly realized that God was here and within. And actually, for the first time in my life, I think, I felt it was okay to be human, that it was adequate to be human. I mean, even my atheism was a very grim sort of atheism, which said there's a vast cosmos of innumerable stars, and you're one tiny speck of accidentally thinking dust on the edge of it, meaning nothing. You felt completely inadequate to be human in that kind of gigantist atheism. So for the first time hearing this gospel of the incarnation, I felt it was okay to be human. And I felt I could turn in a new way to this God who was holy, but was also incarnate, immanent, as well as transcendent. And I understood something of the movement of the Spirit between the two. So I went back to the chaplain and said, I think I can say the Gloria now. And he prepared me for confirmation, and I was confirmed as a member of the Church of England in February of 1980, which was, as they say, life-changing.
What happened after that?
All kinds of things. One of the things that I'd been most afraid of about Christianity, when I began to realize that intellectually and imaginatively I was moving closer towards it, though I don't think I would have ever got there if God hadn't intervened in the way that he did when I was reading the Psalm. But one of the things that I feared about the whole possibility of becoming a Christian again was, I had feared that it would be intellectual suicide, and I knew now from Augustine that it wouldn't be. But I was afraid of stasis, do you know what I mean? Of everything coming to a full stop. That, I found the answer, I've ticked the box, I've said the prayer, there need be no further disturbance of the grey matter. That idea, which was, I have to say, an impression that some ardent young Christians gave me, that they'd now found the solution to everything. They were absolutely right about everything. Everybody else was absolutely wrong about it. and they wouldn't question it in any way. I didn't like that. I found that repellent. The only thing that kept me going with some sense that that might not be the case, actually, was the end of The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis, because in the course of all that, I also reread all the Narnia books. And that great cry further up and further in, and that picture of Aslan's country of heaven as this kind of running up waterfalls and getting higher and higher and closer to the source, that was deeply attractive. And I think that's a better picture of heaven than, you know, everybody standing around with a harp singing hymn 5084. That was attractive. And happily, that proved to be the case. You know, C.S. Lewis, St. Augustine's, one of his great dicta was credo ut intelligam, which means I believe in order to understand. Mm-hmm. I won't arrive at belief by the act of understanding, because as belief is transcendent, it comes as a gift. But now I believe I've got somewhere to think from. I've got a new, and as it turns out, brilliant and beautiful way of interpreting experience in the world. And everything has to be reappraised and reimagined in the light of faith. You reread all the literature you loved, including non-Christian literature, and you find all kinds of movements of the spirit in it. You listen to all the albums you've loved again, and you think, oh, wow, you know. So there was what began and has continued to this day was a great new, as it were, intellectual and imaginative work of discovery and rediscovery, in which I get out of this kind of immanent frame materialist mindset and begin to see everything in the light of Christ. And then, of course, you start reading epistles like Colossians, and you say, you know, he is the first of all things. In him, all things cohere, all things hold together, everything. You know, so that became, it became an intellectual adventure. But of course, it also was a challenge morally, and I needed to lay everything down at the feet of Christ and take some things up again and not others, and all of that had to be done. And I was a school teacher for a while. I thought that was what I was called to do. And then I thought maybe I was called to preach. So I became a lay preacher, a lay reader. But eventually I realized that God was in fact calling me to the priesthood. And I also realized that deep desire I'd had ever since the Keats experience to be a poet myself was also part of that calling. And it took me a while to work out how priesthood and poethood, as it were, worked together. George Herbert was, of course, and John Donne were extremely helpful in that they were both Anglican priest poets. So I realized this was a thing. I mean, it's not a very frequent thing, but it is a thing. And one of the things that had kept me from thinking I should be ordained was I couldn't see anybody among the clergy of the Church of England at the time I was thinking about it that looked or felt remotely like me. But on the other hand, I thought if there's space for John Donne, who's a great love poet, but also then there must be a niche for me somewhere. And so I went forward with it, and I was ordained 10 years after my confirmation in 1990. One of the advantages of that actually was that I've ended up having 3 goes at Cambridge rather than 1, because I was there at the end of the 70s to read English literature, and then I was there at the end of the 80s to do theology. And then at the end of the 90s, I came back to be a chaplain and a lecturer. And I've sort of been there ever since, except I retired from Cambridge a couple of years ago, allegedly. So yeah, that's a little bit of an arc.
Well, let's talk about imagination, because I did read your book, Lifting the Veil, Imagination in the Kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And why is it so important for us to even cultivate and talk of this imagination? Why is it such an important question for today?
I think we have to begin by clearing up a common misunderstanding. Because we use the word imaginary to mean something completely made up and not the case, we can sometimes think if people talk about imagination, or as Keats said, the truth of imagination, they think we're just wishfully thinking that stuff we make up might be true. And that's not what we're doing. We just have to say that at the outset. Now, once we've said that, we can then say, but isn't it interesting how in a play or a story or a piece of art or music, you get a form or shape or a pattern which suddenly allows you to understand and realize and be moved by all kinds of really true things. the story of War and Peace or Les Miserables or Hamlet or anything, might be made up stories, but everybody who's been there, in the way some of those characters speak, everybody's felt, at least at some part, what Hamlet felt when he said to be or not to be. That is the question. Everybody knows what it is to love someone and lose them, and be forced apart by parental politics and a kid's, and when Hamlet says to Ophelia, "Nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered." Okay, there isn't a person actually called Hamlet, and there isn't but that moment of bitterness and parting and confusion, when suddenly out of nowhere, Hamlet the doubter asks for his ex-girlfriend's prayers, that's real.
Yeah, it is.
And so we notice that there's all kinds of truth going on in Madame. But then Coleridge and others notice that, in fact, if you think about the senses, the materialist picture is that all the data, if you like, all the streams of sensation come in through the windows of the eyes and the vibrations of the ears, and are somehow printed on us, kind of as they are, as though we were, as the old people said, a tabula rasa, a blank table. Now, serious thinkers began to realize that couldn't possibly be the case, or it couldn't be just that, because you've got to make sense of the stream of information that's coming in. To use I don't like using computer analogies, they're limited, but to use one briefly, you're being asked to process millions of bits of data all the time, but how do you turn that into knowledge? How out of all that stream of stuff do you shape a human face, or see a star, or make a distinction, or see perspective, or judge between appearance and reality? All those are active powers of the consciousness, or the soul. And Coleridge in particular thought the imagination as a creative power that's able to make beautiful links and see connections and think up metaphors was the power in the soul which took the raw sense data and actually actively, imaginatively helped to shape a proper sense of what's there and of how it coheres and what its significance is. Now, the great breakthrough for Coleridge, I don't know how deep you want to get into the philosophy of this, but you may know that there were two kinds of dualism at work in the so-called Enlightenment. One was Cartesian dualism, where Descartes had said there are only two categories of existence. There's res extensa, which is all that stuff out there that has dimension and shape, and that's just dead matter. So he said, he was wrong, but it's what he said. And then he said there's res cogitans, thinking stuff. And he thought thinking stuff was non-material, and that we had it, and God had it, and angels had it, but otherwise it didn't exist. So there was pure material, which had no purpose or meaning. And then there were our minds and God's mind and angels' minds. And of course, the next generation said, well, why do we need God and the angels? They're not making any difference to anything. Let's jettison them. And then a couple of generations later said, well, maybe we haven't got minds. Maybe it's all just chemical. Yes, it's all childish. That was one dualism, right? But there was another dualism about how we know. And the great propounder of that was the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant pointed out that everything we see, what he calls the phenomena, the appearances, are appearances that our mind shapes. But what is actually out there in its raw state, if you like, unshaped by the perceiving mind and the particular set of lenses ground in the way they are that we happen to have, as opposed to being, say, insects. He said we can never know what the real thing is out there. We can only know what we've perceived. And he made the distinction between phenomena, which is what we think of as the world, and noumena, which is what might really be there. And that's a hell of a chasm to live with, So we had these two big splits, Now, Coleridge wasn't happy with either split, but the Kantian one, he said, Kant's got a point. There must be something in us that deals with the data, discerns its meaning, finds out which are the significant bits, puts them together, perceives beauty, perceives the sublime. That's not passive. That's not like a piece of photographic paper doing that. There's something more going on. But Coleridge said, actually, this is a kind of primary imagination. But the great breakthrough for Coleridge was when he was thinking these thoughts and then finally getting around to rereading the Gospels and reading particularly the prologue to John's Gospel, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And all things were made through him. That there's this mind in God, this logos, in whom and through whom and with him all things are made. And then, of course, John says that he is the light, and light that is the life of man. And then he says, he's the light that lightens everyone that comes into the world. Because as he reads later in Genesis, and of course, John is partly a riff on Genesis, it begins with the same words, as you know, because we are made in the imago Dei, in the image of God. So Coleridge began to wonder whether this inner deep power of imagination was part of the image of God in us. And finally, in Biographia Literaria, published in 1817, he wrote that famous passage in which he says, "The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception," not just making stuff up, perception. And then he could have left it there and people would have just debated it along with Kant, right? But he says, "The living power and prime agent of all human perception." Then he goes on to say, "And as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am." Just at the moment, because eternal is a very important word, the act of creation is eternal in the sense that it's not part of a temporal sequence. He got this from Augustine. You may remember famously in Augustine's Confessions, towards the end of the book, he has a meditation on Genesis. And he reads these beginnings. This is the beginning of Genesis. He says, in the beginning, in principio, as it would have been in his Latin text, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. So Augustine says, well, what does this word beginning mean if it's prior to creation? Because surely time itself is a created thing. As he says, anticipating Einstein, Augustine says, God did not make the world in time, but with time, creates time and space in order that there should be a world. So strictly speaking, the act of creation is not in the order of time, it's eternal. Now, the order of time has beginning, middle, and end. So there's a beginning, whether it's a Big Bang or whatever you want to think it was, which is also the beginning of time. But the true beginning is in God, who is eternal. And in that sense, you and I right now on this Zoom call are as close to the eternal act of creation as, the first star or the first human beings, because eternity is equally related to every point of time. As C.S. Lewis says in the Screwtape Letters, the present moment is the point where time touches eternity. The present is all lit up with golden rays. So the eternal act from our point of view is always going on. Now, what Coleridge is saying, I think, and this is mind-blowing, is that there's something of God, a reflection of God, because we're made in his image, in our perceiving and shaping imagination as we make sense of the world, which is actually reverberating with and connected to God's beautiful and loving act of speaking it into being and making it in the first place. And that's why Coleridge said that the Newtonian image of the world as a mechanical thing operating by laws and like a piece of clockwork, and God as a creator who kind of created the watch or the clock and wound it up and is now retired to an infinite distance, paring his fingernails while the world runs down. That's deism. That's not theism. That's not even remotely Christianity. But he said that's just a false image. He says if we want an analogy for the relationship between creator and creation and us as perceivers, glad perceivers in praise of the beauty of creation, then he says it's much more like a text. In fact, that's what the gospel says. Genesis says, he said, let there be light, and there was light. It's utterance. John says, in the word, all things were made. So that at least invites us to make an analogy. And Coleridge uses the analogy of poetry. He says, when a poet writes a poem, of course, it has to have a physicality. It exists as a text on a printed page. But the page by itself, flat in the book, unread, is not actually a poem. It's a series of squiggles and black marks. The poem only shimmers into being as a poem when the mind of the poet and the mind of the reader meet through the reader's discerning the meaning and beauty of the images in the poem. Then the poem, if you like, shimmers into being as these two imaginations meet. Now, of course, the mind of the reader is guided by the mind of the poet who's made the poem, but the mind of the reader has to be active and imaginative to get the poem. So what Coleridge thought was that God's gift of primary imagination in all of us allows us to perceive his world. But he thought that since the Enlightenment, we had actually created, we're not reading God's poem, we're fashioning an idol of our own. We've got this fantasy that it's a piece of clockwork or a computer mechanism, which has neither philosophical nor scriptural foundations. Instead of letting it be what it is, the second book, as it were, of God, that he's given us his book in the scriptures, and he's spoken his word into the world. So I found all that as I began to read it in my early years as a Christian, hugely exciting. And I still find it hugely exciting. Now, Coleridge goes on to say that what we think of as the imagination, like the creative imagination, the poetic imagination, the imagination that let him write the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, or let Shakespeare write Hamlet, or, he thought that was like the primary imagination in that it was really creative. And Tolkien went on to speak of it as sub-creation, and that it was a special privilege of us among the creatures of God, that like our maker, we too could be makers. And that if we were to make well with a kind of baptized imagination, deeply reading what God has already given us, we could make beautiful and lasting things which might themselves embody truth. And one of the things that I suppose I've particularly done when I was excitedly rereading the whole works of Shakespeare in light of my new Christian faith, or re-remembering them, I knew a lot of them anyway, but I was so excited when I read the beautiful passage about poetry in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where you get this description of poetry. You may remember, it's very famous, where Shakespeare says through one of the characters, it's actually through a character who doesn't like poetry, so he gives the best lines to a kind of hostile witness. But anyway, Theseus in Midsummer Night's Dream says, "The poet's eye in fine frenzy rolling doth glance from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, and as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothingness a local habitation and a name." And that little speech is it's framed both before and after by sentences which talk about two ways of knowing: apprehend and comprehend. Earlier, before that description, the character says that imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. Later on, he says, if it would but apprehend some joy, it comprehends some bringer of that joy. So I began to think there was something beautiful going on between this heaven, earth, earth, heaven, apprehend, comprehend. The idea that it's something that's really true, but you can't get it because you haven't got a form or a shape for it. But imagination bodies forth the forms and things unknown. It gives to what is real but unknowable a knowable and lovable and holdable and nameable form. So I got that far before my conversion. But when I reread that passage as a Christian, a little more deeply soaked in the scriptures, I was saying, what does this remind me of? This whole kind of earth, heaven, earth, apprehend, comprehend, invisible, visible. And right in the middle of it is this bodies forth and local habitation and a name. And I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, this is exactly like the prologue to John's Gospel. Because you remember in John's Gospel, it goes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the same was with God, and all things were made through him. And you read it, and this is terrific truth and philosophy and wisdom and mystery, but you can't see it, can you? Kind of the words just going around like that in the top of your head. And then finally you get to verse 14, and it says, and the Word was made flesh, bodied forth, made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld, we actually saw in this world with our eyes in bodily form, we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And I suddenly thought, now that's astonishing. I think Shakespeare has framed the account of his art in which all the possible meanings, which we could never quite get, coalesce and are given a body in the form of the story or the play or the poem. And then we can comprehend them, we can enter into them. But maybe we can only do that because God, the maker, and you know that the Greek word for to make in that in John's gospel is poiein. It's the word we get poet from, you know. You could say he poeted everything was poeted that was poeted, and without his poetry, there was no poem, you know, be another way to translate it. So what if God, the supreme being and the meaning of all things, looks at his creation and says, if I stay up here disembodied and wordless, you're never going to get this. What if I was to take the whole of heaven, the very heart of my love, the very core of who I am, that I want to communicate to you, and body it forth, make it flesh in a person, all of me for all of you, but now with a shape and a name and, of course, a local habitation. I mean, the first question, I mean, Shakespeare would have been working with both Latin and English Bibles. The first question of the disciples to Jesus in John's Gospel is, Master, where are you staying? I mean, Magister ubi habitas, where is your habitation? And of course, John has that partly because he's riffing on Genesis. And the first question from God to human beings in Genesis is, where are you? We were hiding from God. We've always been hiding from God. And then we made this stupid idea that God was really hiding from us. And they had this idea, the Deus absconditas, that God is not there. And then God said, no, let me make this clear. You are the guys are hiding, and I'm going to come. But if you want to say, where are you? Here I am. And of course, before Abraham was, I am, you know, the infinite I am. So I began to see a parallel between the best account of poetry by the greatest poet and the most glorious account of creation in the, you know, in the most mystical gospel, and realized they were really talking about the same thing. And that perhaps we can be creative and we can trust our creative imagination because we have a God who creatively and poetically bodied forth all of heaven in the body and person of Jesus.
That's a lot.
Sorry, long answer to a short question, eh?
But there's so much that's there. Even you're just scratching the surface of so many different pieces. Even when I was reading your book, there was so much underneath the surface of every poet that you mentioned, everyone talking about a Christian imagination, how to think this through. It took me a bit because I'm not used to thinking in those ways.
Yeah.
It was a challenge. At the same time, I would stop and I would think of it and I would meditate further, trying to go deeper, trying to understand this idea of the Christian imagination and why we needed to cultivate a Christian imagination. And I realized we don't like to think very often anymore, and especially when it comes to matters like poetry. But we do like things like movies and that aspect of art. But you're taking us into this journey, as you say, imagination in the kingdom of God, kind of reimagining what we understand about who God is, how he's working in the world. Why is that important right now?
Yeah. So of course you can. I mean, the first thing to say is that I've spent a lot of time and you know, attention and prayer thinking about how the imagination works and why we can trust it and how it relates to the gospel, because somebody should do that, and I happen to be the guy that's doing it. But you don't have to do all of that in order to enjoy and be blessed by a great piece of art. The thing itself is doing its work and blessing you. And every time you go back into that art or that painting or that music or that poem, it'll have a little bit more to offer. And that's a beautiful thing. But Christians in particular, I'm writing the way I am partly because historically, from the Reformation onwards, among some of the Protestant churches, there has been a distrust or a mistrust of the imagination and the arts, which is partly actually a kind of almost, it's an almost accidental byproduct of a separate discussion about images and idolatry. And the whole discussion about statues of saints and all of that stuff. I mean, that was a proper discussion to have. And there may have been some places and some conditions in which people were worshipping sticks and stones when they should have been worshipping the Lord. That may, I mean, that's a separate discussion. But that was a proper discussion that was being had, right? But somehow the kind of spillover from that, instead of just suspecting a situation where a person didn't understand that a statue was a representation and that the reality was beyond the statue, the kind of discussion Paul had, you know, in Athens in Acts 17, where he says, he whom you worship without knowing I preach, i.e. you're really already on to the beginnings of God, but he doesn't live in statues. That kind of discussion spilt over into a general suspicion on the part of Protestants in general and Calvinists in particular of all the imaginative and creative arts. And yet the imaginative and creative arts have been used historically by the church and obviously throughout the scriptures beautifully to glorify God. So I'll just turn that phone off. So I felt that at this point, when we kind of need to get rid of a little bit of our historical baggage, to be honest, I felt that the time had come, and I'm not the only person, lots of other people, Jeremy Begbie and Paul Fidesz and all kinds of writers in the last 20 or 30 years have said, can we, as fairly thoroughgoing Orthodox Christians, I'm a Trinitarian and I believe that the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ really happened and makes all the difference in the world. Okay.
Yeah.
Those of us who are in that sense fully, believing Christians who think there is a place for the arts and who thinks there's been a false divorce between reason and imagination and a false split and a kind of dissing of the arts as though they were only private, subjective and possibly dangerous things, that we need to defend them, and we need to defend them in fully, thoroughly thought through, philosophically sound Orthodox Christian terms. Now, I do, and there's a bit of me I do that in academic books as well, like Faith, Hope and Poetry. I kind of do that so you don't have to, but you can rely on the fact that somebody's done that thinking. But when I wrote Lifting the Veil, I decided to take the core of what I was saying there and try and make it available particularly to Christian artists or to pastors who have artists in their church, to try and give a good theological grounding to a proper Christian use of a baptized imagination. That's really what I'm trying to do in that book. And I'm trying to inspire and encourage a rising generation of creatives, as you call them in America. It's extraordinary American habit of taking adjectives like creative and turning them into nouns unnecessarily. Anyway, let us use the term creatives. I realize they're all out there. Some of them, Christian artists are in a very difficult position because on the one hand, they can be in churches that suspect them because they don't know what the arts are or what to make of them. And historically, they've got this baggage about images and idols and all that sort of nonsense. So they're kind of on the edge in their church. And then when they go into the world, the wonderful, bohemian avant-garde world of artists, they're totally on the edge there because they're Christians. And everybody else is, some kind of, anarcho-nihilist, So these poor people are actually in a place in between. Now, actually, as it happens, that's a brilliantly creative place to be. And from that place, they can both renew the church and convert the pagan artists if they do it right. And that's what, great artists, visual artists like Makoto Fujimura, for example, and his whole idea of culture care and so on, that's where all that is coming from. That's where a journal like Image is coming from. It's trying to support the artist who is, as it were, trapped between two margins, but actually also in this beautiful place between two margins where great change and creativity can happen. And I hope my book, Lifting the Veil, is a contribution to that.
I think it is. It is interesting to me as I was reading the book, talking about the imagination in the kingdom of God. There has been a growth in the literature. As you mentioned, your friend Jeremy Begbie, in his book, Beholding the Glory, he talks about that. And I remember, I think it was him that was talking about, there were two between the Protestants and Catholics talking about examining film. It may not have been him. Might have been that series that Zondervan did on cultural
Beholding the Glory,
exegesis.
he edited it and didn't, but it's a collection of essays by a number of different, I read the one on literature in there, but there is one on film and there's one on and that was a great book because it took one doctrine, the doctrine of the incarnation, and said, how can we look at that through the eyes of artists? Because one of the things that Jeremy says is not only that churches should support artists, but that the arts are one of the media through which we can do good theology, that we should do theology through the arts, that we shouldn't, it's not a case of the theologian sitting and thinking syllogisms in their study, and then maybe if you're lucky, they raid the world of the arts for a quick illustration, which has no actual effect on their thought. On the contrary, you want to take a great art like poetry and take a passage of poetry about poetry, like the passage from Shakespeare I quoted, and say, what does that do for my theology? How can I bring that back to help me reimagine perhaps an over-familiar piece of theology and suddenly see it in a tremendously new and exciting light? That's what the arts can do. I mean, people who do music or painting or song about rivers or the wind or fire are all providing something wonderful and rich for anybody who wants to do a theology of the Holy Spirit, because those are the three chief biblical images of the Holy Spirit. And the more an artist helps us to delight in and see what a stream or a blowing wind is, the more we will know about the Holy Spirit. You know, that's why I think Shelley's Ode to the West Wind is a great poem about the Holy Spirit, even though Shelley would not have said he believed in the Holy Spirit. But the poet Shelley knew better than the atheist Shelley.
Mm. There are so many things that you bring up as we're talking about this. When you're talking about cultivating a Christian imagination, how has the Christian imagination been impeded in our contemporary cultural moment?
Well, I think it's been attacked from two sides, as it were. One of the big divisions in the whole of modern thought since the Enlightenment, which springs from Descartes' dualism between the peculiar non-material stuff that's in here and all the actual physical mechanical workings of the world out there, res cogitans, res extensa, right? Mm-hmm. One consequence of that, it wasn't something that Descartes intended, but it happened, was that we got this split between so-called objective truth and mere subjectivity, right? Mm-hmm. And the arts, I'm talking about general philosophy of the world now, I'm not talking about Christians in particular, but the arts got relegated to this mere subjectivity. It was all touchy-feely inner stuff, but it didn't make any difference to how atoms work, or do you know what I mean? It was, yeah. So it's kind of like a sort of bit of just compensatory fantasy for the grimness of the world, but didn't affect the fact that the world was grim, right? Whereas, of course, what people like Coleridge and, you know, the great thinkers of the past were saying was, no, you only think the world is grim because you're only using the eye of science and reason on it. But there's actually much more out there than you know, and that's why you need the eye of imagination. I mean, C.S. Lewis put it brilliantly in one of his later essays called, oddly, Blue Spells and Flallan Spheres. But anyway, in the essay, he says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. And because we downgraded the imagination, we have lots of information, but no meaning. And then when an artist comes up with some meaning, they say, oh, well, that's just subjective. So there's that split. That's one thing that has put the imagination and the work of imaginative artists in peril and marginalized it. And then, as I say, you get, as an added complication, you get this historical baggage going back to the Reformation and extreme Calvinist reactions to extreme Catholicism, where that somehow has got overlaid on the imagination debate and got mixed up with vain imaginations or images or idols or whatever, you know, which is really not relevant to it. I mean, people don't go to a film and bow down, you know, they don't listen to a piece of music and say, you know, I'm actually going to devote my life to that B flat major chord. You know, they don't do that. They say something beautiful came to me through it. They always say through it. They always use the language of the icon rather than the idol. I don't think there's a danger of idolatry, except in certain kinds of very obvious Hollywood films, you know, and the whole cult of the Hollywood star. I think there's a genuine danger of idolatry there, but I think that's a separate issue. I'm talking about the great arts. What I think we have to do now is, at the moment, many arts are flourishing, but they're flourishing in a kind of cultural apartheid, a kind of separate development, where we cede to science all the stuff that really makes a difference. Science and economics are actually in charge of the world. And then we say, well, if you've got a bit of time off and you've got nothing better to do, go to a museum or an art gallery. But that's not about what the world is. That's the split we have. And as long as we do that, then art is going to be seen as a self-indulgent luxury rather than a necessity. But actually, for the deepest things of being human, it's a necessity, and we need to bring it back it all goes back to what Jesus said, of course, when he gives us the two great commandments, and the first is this: to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind. Now, somewhere in that all between soul and mind, part of both, is your imagination. The whole of your imaginative and creative capacity is naturally to be drawn forth and used in loving God. And the second is like, namely this: love your neighbor as yourself. Now, when I think he says the second is like, I think he also means that you need all those capacities, heart, mind, soul, strength, to do any decent loving of another person. And I think artists involve themselves very strongly in loving their neighbors. I mean, when Picasso painted that extraordinary painting, Guernica, which is an astonishing and revolutionary piece of art, it was also a cry of horror at what human beings do to each other. And it was a prognostication and a prophecy of what was to come in the Second World War, and a word of warning from a deep humanitarian to the rest of humanity, depicting the actual savagery we were unleashing on each other. That was an act of loving the neighbor as well, if you like, of loving God.
What do you see as the future is shaping in this cultural moment where you have more people that are being drawn to the arts? You see Christianity in it. I mean, and you've traveled between the UK, the US. I mean, you've traveled around the world. But let me rephrase my question. What is the difference then that you see in the cultural expression of Christian faith between the UK and the United States?
Okay, that's a very interesting and difficult question. I think the orientation of the Christian must always be outward to the world, and particularly to the person who hasn't yet found that faith. We have this beautiful thing to share, and we can begin sharing it by serving our neighbors in all kinds of practical ways. So one of the problems that I perceive in Christian art, I think I perceive this more in America than in England, I'm not quite sure, but is that when artists find a place in the church, it always ends up being serving the church. It's like, you share our belief, we're comfortable with you, so you can make nice art that helps us to feel the faith we already think we know and understand, and isn't going to challenge us too much, and is just going to be a beautiful chorus for us to sing. Do you know what I mean? There's a kind of inward focusing of the art into the Christian community. Now, there's nothing wrong with writing poetry or other art to serve the Christian community. I do it myself. My book of poems, Sounding the Seasons, is for the church, and I'm glad to serve my fellow Christians, and I know that those poems help people to express and to grow in their faith. But I also hold the hope, which is why I write other books like my Singing Bowl collection, which is much more general poetry, that I might have a chance through my art to do for somebody else, even if it was just for one other person, what George MacDonald did for C.S. Lewis when he was a 16-year-old atheist, getting on that train and reading Fantastes and feeling this bright, luminous cloud. And he says he passed a frontier. His imagination was baptized by reading George MacDonald, who he didn't even know was a Christian, in a book which is not overtly a Christian at all, although it's a fantasy which is just resonant with Christian truth. Now, I want to write, right now I'm working on a long poetic renditioning, I hope, beautiful retelling of all the King Arthur stories. And I want to do, but I'm restoring the faith and the symbols of the faith, where they've been excised by Hollywood. And I'm trying to write something I think that I hope lots of teenagers will love and read. And before they know it, they've begun to glimpse a Christian worldview. They've begun to imagine, before they can believe, something of what this beautiful sacramental world would look like if we felt it was drenched with God's love and meaning and purpose, and wasn't just a mere concatenation of atoms in the void. I'm trying to do that. And I think Christians should encourage their artists to be outward facing and make art for the whole world, and not just decorative arts for the church. And I think so. That's the first thing. But the second thing, which is really exciting, I think, is that some of the greatest artists who are not Christian, when you get to talk to them personally and get them to just come out a little bit about what they think they're doing, it's amazing how close they are. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was once invited to preach what's called the varnishing sermon, which is a strange English tradition in London, but before the exhibition of the Royal Academy every year in the summer. Unbelievably, all these atheist or shock outrage artists, the kind that, you know, all troop along, meek as lambs, to St. James's Piccadilly and hear, because we've done it for 200 years. So like, why wouldn't we do it again, you know? And they get to hear a sermon. And I preached this sermon once, and I talked about exposure and the vulnerability of exposure, because they were all about to go and unveil their art that was hanging for all to see, and in which they'd put something of their heart and soul and who they are. And they knew not what gaze, hostile or mocking, but something gave them the courage to do it. Something made them feel it was worthwhile to have it hang there for a while. And then I just gently turned that to the end, to the cross. I talked about God as the divine artist and this greatest thing he's ever done, everything bodied forth in his beautiful son. And his son, just like one of these pictures, is nailed up and just hangs there. And he, the Father, in the Son, and the Son in the Father, is utterly exposed and defenseless. And yet in that exposed defenseless is offering the world a radical reappraisal of everything it does. And that's the very thing these artists, and 2 or 3 of these artists came up to me and said, you know, I've never thought of it like that. I always thought this Christianity was this dumb religion from the childhood of mankind. But I know what that's like. It makes me think about Jesus in a completely new way, because it speaks into the thing I know. Now, that kind of thing can happen all the time. And there's amazing, you know, it's amazing how all kinds of people you wouldn't think are a lot closer to Christianity than you think they are. If only there was somebody who loved and appreciated what they did and spoke to them from within that language.
Do you think there is a movement of people starting to see that?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, the other really interesting thing that's happening is that in the most unexpected place of at all, which is people who, having rejected the faith, realize there's a kind of magic and enchantment and beauty in the world, and have returned to the old paganisms, the kind of neo-pagans, and people who kind of go on long, you know, treks in the wilderness or live in yurts or, you know, do what people call tree hugging. I think there's nothing wrong with tree hugging. But anyway, quite a number of people from that world are, curious enough, coming to Christ. I'm in long conversation at the moment with an extraordinary guy called Martin Shaw, you know, has a huge sort of Substack following in the kind of, and he's one of the great storytellers in the tradition of sort of Robert Bly and kind of Iron John, and these old folk tales are really about our inner life kind of thing. Mm. And he has quite literally been visited by Christ. I mean, he had these dreams of a great stag coming in with its antlers, but with a cross, coming in and wrecking his house. And then, you know, he felt a light coming from heaven. And here's what he calls the mossy-faced Christ. He realized that the deepest truth he'd always been looking for, unexpectedly, was Christ himself in and through and loving his creation. And, you know, he's been baptized now. And, you know, then Paul Kingsnorth is another example. There's all kinds of people who are kind of coming to faith because they've looked deeply enough into something else to know what depth they are. And because also Christ is the fulfiller of things, you know. Here's one greater than Solomon is here, but one greater than Apollo is here, one greater than Pan is here, but not less than Apollo and Pan. And people who loved Apollo or Pan can find all that was best in that in Christ. As Paul says, he whom you worship without knowing, him I preach. Now, Paul could only say that because he said to the Athenians, men of Athens, as I walked through, I observed the objects of worship. I see that you are very religious. He whom you worship without knowing. He didn't say, you're a bunch of dirty pagans who aren't kosher, you know, sod you. Which is actually, Luke tells us that's how he felt when he actually arrived at Athens. But he overcame that, and he really looked and he really listened. And he goes on to say, as you remember in that great speech in Acts, some of your own poets have said, we are his children, in him we live and move and have our being. That's pagan Greek poetry he's quoting there. In fact, you know, now, I think there's beginning to be enough Christians with enough confidence in their faith to really know and love pagans and recognize that actually pagans are a lot closer to Christ than mere materialists. After all, the gospel was eventually spread through Europe in an entirely religiously active pagan world. And in a sense, they had enough of the language to get it. And I rather rejoice in the fact that scientific materialism is collapsing on every side. Some people, when it collapses, become Christians. Hallelujah. Some people become neo-pagans, but that doesn't trouble me at all. I think that may be a proper stepping stage on the journey to faith. In fact, there's a poem by C.S. Lewis about exactly that, called A Cliche Come Out of Its Cage. The cliche being the world's gone back to paganism. And basically that poem says, if only, like that would be a way better starting place, you know, than where we are now. And I think that's starting to happen.
What do you see with all of your work when you go to be with Jesus? I mean, what do you hope to have accomplished?
Well, it's difficult to say. I don't know. I don't know when we're with Jesus whether we'll use the talk of having accomplished anything ourselves at all. I think, you know, it's like Paul planted, Apollos watered, but, you know, it is God who gives the growth. I will hope that through some of the things I've said and done and conversations I've had, that Christ himself will have sown some seeds in and through me. My friend, the poet, the great Irish poet Micheál O'Shiel, was once asked whether he thought his poetry sowed gospel seeds. And he kind of almost shook back and said, oh, goodness me. He said, no, I don't. He said, if you're referring to the parable of the sower, he said, I take it that Jesus is both the sower and the sown, that the word is both the one who sows and the seed that is sown. But he said, I noticed that that parable pays a great deal of attention to the soil and the kind and quality of the soil. And he says, what I hope my poetry or any arts do is it's like taking clumped up stony soil and putting in a griddle and shaking it about and getting the stones out. He says, I hope at best my poetry may have jostled the soil of the imagination so that when the sower himself comes and who is also the seed, it finds some good ground. And I think that's pretty much what I'd hope to say for myself as well, that I jostled the soil of the imagination. But I think it's Jesus who makes Christians.
Oh, that's a very, very good point. You've traveled both between North America and the UK. What are the differences that you've seen in the Christian expression?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one is that in as far as church going and public and Christian expression is concerned, America is the more Christian country. We're more secularized. But paradoxically, because of the separation of state and church in America, America can officially seem more atheist, even though it's actually more full of thriving Christian communities. On the other hand, England can seem more Christian because our monarch is the head of the church, and because we have chaplains in universities, and we have vicars going into schools, you know. So we have a little bit more of the remnants of Christendom. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, there's some ways maybe America could learn from that, but actually we could learn from America about being a lot more upfront and clear as Christians about our faith, and happier to share it without embarrassment.
What do you think the future is of Christianity in the UK?
Well, at the moment, my own beloved denomination, the Church of England, is in numerical decline. My view about numerical decline is these things come and go, and Jesus started with 12. So even if we're only down to 12 in England, that'll be enough to kickstart the whole thing again. So I'm not panicking, you know. I think revival will come, but I think it may be quite a long time coming. And I think it may take forms that the present church doesn't recognize. We have a phrase that the church uses here, fresh expressions of church. And there may be some fresh expressions of church. I think they're going to be more grounded. I think they're going to be more local. I think they're going to be very much concerned with people having to be resilient and live together through the changes that are coming environmentally, if not anything else, you know. And I think we're going to have to return to a simpler and more closely communal way of living. And that's the very way of living in which Christianity spread through England in the first place. So I think that might be quite good for us, actually. Well, anyway, I'm afraid my time is coming to an end. That's what that.
No, that's okay. I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a joy. I mean, there's so much that I don't even feel like we've touched the surface. I've watched many of your videos, read your books. I know we're not even skimming the top of all of the things that you've done. You know, what's a final thought that you can leave with our listeners based upon your book, you know, Lifting the Veil?
Well, I think I would say your imagination is part of the image of God in you. Now, like all of us in the fall, it's shadowed, it has its dark side, but it must be brought back into the light and to Jesus. We don't war against the imagination. We baptize and bring it in as part of the heart and soul and mind. And if you want to strengthen and feed and develop your imagination, then get out there and love and enjoy the arts. Listen to music, hear great songs, read poems, read novels, make time for those things. And remember, that's not some private diversion. That's about finding out how things really are.
That's something that I think we especially in the circles that I've been in, that's something that hasn't been done very often, which was why it was such a pleasant experience in uncovering and encountering your books and listening to you, seeing how all of these pieces fit together. Because I do think Christ reveals himself in the arts. I think it's a way to point others to Christ, but especially in your books, made me think about my imagination in ways that I'd never thought before. And
Yeah.
that
Well, he
was
cares
very
for
helpful.
beauty. I mean, one of the most lovely sayings of Christ is when Mary of Bethany breaks the precious jar of alabaster and pours it out over Jesus' feet. And Judas, who's the classic cynic, you know, Oscar Wilde said, a cynic is a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And he's just got the cash register going and saying, oh, 300 denarii, we could, yeah. But what does Jesus says? It's the only time in the gospel that he uses this word. He says, she has done a beautiful thing. And wherever the gospel is preached, she will be remembered. There's the artist, apparently wasteful, utterly devoted, doing this apparently useless and beautiful thing, which moves Jesus to his very heart.
That is a good word to finish. Malcolm, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate
My
it.
pleasure.
How can people learn more about what you're doing?
Well, you've mentioned the this little YouTube called Spell in the Library, which is just for fun, and but I also have a blog, which is, I don't know, malcolmguite.com would get it. It's a WordPress blog, and I post fairly regularly on that. If you subscribe to the email thing, that's free, of course, and you just get an email with what I post when I post it, and that's all. I don't do Substack or anything. I just want to make all that freely available. I have a little thing where people say, hey, you could buy me a coffee or a cake, you know, a little page to do that, you know. So, but basically, I try and put as much as I can out there, and of course, all my books are there in shops or libraries.
Well, I know that I've encountered them, and I particularly enjoy your YouTube videos. They're entertaining, they're fun to watch, and they're fun to listen to too. But
again, it's easy to subscribe to those, and then you just get them, and you can ignore them if you want to, or you can sit and be entertained for 10 minutes, you know.
And they are entertaining. They're very entertaining. So I just wanted to thank you for coming on Apollo Swattered.
My pleasure.